It's Sunday night, and someone is watching a motivational video. Their heart is racing, their eyes are wide with determination, and they feel like they could conquer the world. They write down their goals, plan out their week, and go to bed feeling invincible. By Tuesday afternoon, they're back on the couch, scrolling through their phone, and those goals feel like they were made by a completely different person. This isn't laziness. This isn't weakness. This is motivation doing exactly what it's designed to do, which is to fail. The motivation industry is worth billions of dollars. There are motivational speakers filling stadiums, motivational books topping bestseller lists, and motivational content flooding every social media platform. People consume this content religiously, getting their regular hits of inspiration and determination. Yet study after study shows that motivation has almost no correlation with long-term success. The people who achieve their goals aren't necessarily more motivated than those who don't. In fact, they often report feeling less motivated. So what's actually happening here? Why does motivation feel so powerful in the moment but prove so useless over time? The answer lies in understanding what motivation actually is from a neurological and psychological perspective. Motivation is fundamentally an emotional state, a temporary surge of neurochemicals, primarily dopamine, that creates feelings of excitement, possibility, and energy. When someone watches that motivational video or reads that inspiring quote, their brain is experiencing a chemical high. This isn't metaphorical. It's literally the same reward pathways that activate with drugs, food, or sex. The feeling is real and powerful, but like any high, it's temporary. The brain cannot maintain that elevated state. It's neurologically impossible. This is the first fundamental problem with motivation. It's being treated as a sustainable fuel source when it's actually a spark. A spark can start a fire, but you can't run an engine on sparks alone. You need a different kind of fuel, something that burns slowly and consistently rather than flashing bright and disappearing. Most people are trying to build their entire lives on these momentary chemical surges, and then they're confused and ashamed when those surges inevitably fade. They think something is wrong with them. In reality, something is wrong with their understanding of how human behavior actually works. The second problem is that motivation is almost entirely feeling-based, and feelings are terrible guides for action. Human emotions are designed to be responsive to immediate circumstances, not to long-term goals. When someone feels motivated, it's usually because they're imagining a positive future outcome or reacting to immediate pain or inspiration. But feelings fluctuate constantly based on sleep, stress, blood sugar, social interactions, and countless other variables that have nothing to do with their actual goals. Building a behavior system on feelings is like building a house on sand. It will work until the first storm, and then everything collapses. Research in behavioral psychology consistently shows that successful behavior change relies on systems, not feelings. A system is a set of predetermined actions that get executed regardless of emotional state. It's a structure that removes the need for motivation because the decision has already been made. The person who goes to the gym every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 6 a.m. isn't asking themselves each morning whether they feel motivated. They've eliminated the decision point. They've created automaticity. The behavior happens not because they feel like doing it, but because it's simply what they do at that time on those days. This reveals something crucial about human psychology. People don't need motivation to do things they've made automatic. Nobody needs motivation to brush their teeth or take a shower. These behaviors have been repeated so many times in specific contexts that they've become part of identity and routine. The behavior precedes the feeling, not the other way around. The person becomes someone who works out, and that identity executes the behavior regardless of momentary motivation levels. This is the opposite of how motivation-based approaches work, where people try to generate the feeling first and then hope it produces the behavior. There's also the issue of what psychologists call the motivation-action gap. Studies show that most people significantly overestimate how much motivation they'll need to start a behavior, and significantly underestimate how quickly motivation appears once they've started. This is because motivation is often a consequence of action rather than a prerequisite for it. The experience goes like this. Someone doesn't want to work out. They force themselves to start anyway, and within 5 or 10 minutes, they're actually engaged and the resistance has disappeared. The motivation showed up after the action began, not before. This is Newton's first law applied to psychology. An object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion. Getting started is the hardest part, because it requires overcoming inertia without the benefit of momentum or feeling. But once movement begins, continuation becomes easier. Most motivational content focuses on trying to generate enough feeling to overcome that initial inertia, which is the exact wrong approach. The correct approach is to make the initial action so small and so automatic that it bypasses the need for motivation entirely. This is where the concept of minimum viable action comes in. Instead of trying to motivate themselves to work out for an hour, someone commits to putting on workout clothes. Instead of motivating themselves to write a book, they commit to writing one sentence. The action is so small that motivation isn't required, but once the workout clothes are on, the psychological cost of actually working out has decreased dramatically. Once the sentence is written, writing another one requires less activation energy. The behavior chain gets triggered not through motivation, but through removing friction and creating momentum. Another fundamental flaw in motivation-based approaches is that they ignore the role of environment entirely. Human behavior is extraordinarily context-dependent. The same person will make completely different choices in different environments, not because their motivation changed, but because the environmental cues and frictions changed. Someone might have tremendous motivation to eat healthy, but if they're surrounded by junk food and healthy food requires extra effort to obtain, their behavior will follow the path of least resistance regardless of their feelings. Environmental design is far more powerful than motivation because it works on automatic processes rather than conscious ones. If someone removes junk food from their house entirely, they can't eat it even in moments of low motivation. If they lay out their workout clothes the night before, the friction to exercise decreases. If they delete social media apps from their phone, they can't mindlessly scroll even when stressed. These environmental modifications work regardless of emotional state, which means they work consistently. Motivation fluctuates daily. Environment remains constant. This is why the most successful people often describe themselves as lazy or unmotivated. They're not relying on motivation at all. They've designed their environments and systems to make desired behaviors the path of least resistance and undesired behaviors difficult or impossible. They've removed the need for willpower and motivation by removing friction and temptation. The behavior happens automatically because everything else would require more effort. There's also a dark side to motivation culture that rarely gets discussed. The constant consumption of motivational content can actually become a substitute for action rather than a catalyst for it. This is called motivational procrastination. Someone feels bad about not working toward their goals, so they watch a motivational video. The video gives them that dopamine hit and makes them feel like they're doing something productive. They feel better, which removes the discomfort that might have actually pushed them toward real action. They've satisfied the psychological need without addressing the actual problem. It's behavioral masturbation, self-stimulation that feels good but produces nothing. Social media has made this exponentially worse. People can now broadcast their intentions and goals, receive validation and encouragement, and get a motivation hit without doing any actual work. Studies show that telling people about goals before achieving them actually decreases the likelihood of success because the social recognition satisfies the psychological reward that the accomplishment was meant to provide. The brain has already received its dopamine payment, so why do the hard work? Motivation culture, especially online motivation culture, is often counterproductive precisely because it provides the feeling of progress without requiring actual progress. The motivational speaker industry also has a perverse incentive structure. Speakers make money by making people feel good, not by creating lasting behavior change. If the audience leaves feeling pumped up and inspired, the speaker was successful, even if nothing in the audience's life actually changes. In fact, if people achieved their goals permanently, they'd stop consuming motivational content. The industry needs people to stay in a cycle of inspiration, attempt, failure, and renewed inspiration. It's not a conspiracy. It's just the natural outcome of an industry built around selling feelings rather than systems. This doesn't mean inspiration is useless. It means inspiration's role is vastly overrated and misunderstood. Inspiration can be the spark that makes someone consider change. It can provide hope when someone feels stuck. But the transition from inspiration to actual sustained change requires completely different mechanisms. It requires decision architecture, environmental design, identity shifts, and behavioral systems. These are the tools that actually work, but they're not exciting. They don't produce immediate emotional highs, so they don't go viral, they don't fill stadiums, and they don't make billions of dollars. There's also the problem of motivation's relationship with identity. Most people are trying to motivate themselves to act like someone they're not. They're trying to become a morning person when they're naturally a night person. They're trying to become extroverted when they're introverted. They're trying to love exercise when they hate it. This creates constant internal resistance because the behavior contradicts their identity. No amount of motivation can overcome a contradictory identity in the long term. The identity will always win. Successful behavior change often requires identity change rather than motivation injection. Instead of trying to motivate themselves to work out, someone begins to see themselves as an athlete. Instead of trying to motivate themselves to write, they begin to see themselves as a writer. The identity shift makes the behavior feel natural rather than forced. It aligns internal self-concept with external action. Once the identity is established, the behavior flows from it automatically, requiring minimal motivation or willpower. This is why small, consistent actions are more powerful than large, motivated bursts. Each small action is a vote for the identity someone is building. Someone who writes one sentence every day is repeatedly telling themselves, "I am a writer." Someone who does 10 push-ups every morning is repeatedly telling themselves, "I am someone who exercises." These identity votes accumulate over time until the identity becomes real and the behaviors become automatic expressions of that identity. The research on habit formation supports this completely. Studies show that it takes an average of 66 days for a behavior to become automatic, though the range varies widely from 18 days to over 200 depending on the person and behavior. During this formation period, motivation will spike and crash repeatedly. The people who succeed are those who have systems in place to execute the behavior, regardless of motivation level. The people who fail are those relying on maintaining high motivation for 2 to 6 months straight, which is neurologically impossible. There's also the issue of motivation's relationship with difficulty. Motivation tends to be high when tasks seem exciting and new, and low when tasks become difficult or boring. This is exactly backward from what's needed. The times when people most need to take action are precisely the times when motivation is lowest. During plateaus, during difficulties, during the boring middle when novelty has worn off but mastery hasn't been achieved. These are the moments that determine success or failure, and motivation is completely absent during these moments. Systems work during these moments, identity works during these moments, motivation doesn't. Another psychological phenomenon that undermines motivation is called licensing. When people do something good, they often unconsciously give themselves permission to do something bad. Someone has a motivated workout session, so they reward themselves with extra food. Someone has a productive morning, so they give themselves permission to waste the afternoon. The motivation and effort in one area creates a psychological sense of having earned relaxation or indulgence in another area. The net result is often zero progress or even regression. Systems that remove the decision point entirely prevent this licensing effect. The concept of activation energy from chemistry applies perfectly here. Every behavior requires a certain amount of energy to initiate. Motivation is an attempt to generate that activation energy through emotional intensity. But there's another approach, which is to lower the activation energy required. If the behavior requires almost no energy to start, motivation becomes irrelevant. This is why the most effective behavioral interventions focus on removing barriers and friction rather than generating motivation. Change the environment to make the desired behavior the easiest option, and motivation stops mattering. This also explains why punishment and negative motivation tend to fail even more spectacularly than positive motivation. Fear, guilt, and shame can create short bursts of desperate action, but they're even more unsustainable than positive motivation because they're psychologically damaging. People can't maintain fear-based behavior patterns long-term without serious mental health consequences, and the moment the fear decreases, the behavior stops. Negative motivation is like trying to run a car on explosions rather than fuel. It creates movement, but it destroys the engine in the process. The alternative to motivation-based behavior isn't cold robotic discipline. It's what psychologists call implementation intentions, which are if-then plans that remove the need for in-the-moment decision-making. If it's Monday at 6 a.m., then I go to the gym. If I finish dinner, then I write for 30 minutes. If I feel stressed, then I go for a walk. These conditional plans bypass motivation entirely by turning behavior into an automatic response to specific cues. The decision is made once in advance, and then it executes automatically when the condition is met. Research shows that implementation intentions dramatically increase success rates compared to motivation-based approaches. In studies comparing people who set goals with high motivation versus people who set implementation intentions with neutral motivation, the implementation intention group succeeds far more often. The specific plan beats the intense feeling every single time. This is because the plan works with how the brain actually processes behavior, while motivation is fighting against the brain's natural tendency toward homeostasis and energy conservation. There's also the reality that most people are using motivation as an avoidance strategy. They're waiting to feel motivated as an excuse not to start. If they never feel motivated enough, they never have to face the possibility of failure or the discomfort of effort. The lack of motivation becomes a shield against risk. This is why some people can spend years waiting for motivation that never arrives. They're not actually waiting, they're avoiding. And motivation culture enables this avoidance by suggesting that the feeling is necessary when it's not. The people who achieve difficult things consistently describe a completely different experience. They describe showing up regardless of how they feel. They describe pushing through boredom and resistance. They describe building systems that don't require emotional fuel. They describe identity alignment, where the behavior feels natural rather than forced. None of this involves motivation. In fact, many high achievers actively avoid motivational content because they've learned it's a distraction from the actual work. This doesn't mean life becomes joyless grinding. It means joy and satisfaction come from different sources. They come from competence, from progress, from identity alignment, from the satisfaction of following through on commitments. These are deeper and more sustainable than the dopamine spike of motivational inspiration. They're the difference between the sugar rush of candy and the sustained energy of complex carbohydrates. One feels more intense in the moment, the other actually powers you through the day. The final and perhaps most important point is that motivation frames behavior change as something you have to psychologically amp yourself up for rather than as a natural expression of who you're becoming. It maintains the gap between current self and desired self, requiring constant energy to bridge that gap. Identity-based behavior change eliminates the gap entirely by making the behavior part of who you are rather than something you're trying to force yourself to do. So what's the alternative? Start with incredibly small actions that require zero motivation. Build systems that remove friction and decision points. Design environments that make desired behaviors automatic and undesired behaviors difficult. Create implementation intentions that bypass the need for willpower. Focus on identity and becoming rather than on doing and achieving. Stack small wins until the identity feels real and the behaviors feel natural. Use motivation when it appears, but never rely on it. Build structures that work when motivation is completely absent, because that's most of the time. Understanding that motivation rarely works isn't depressing. It's liberating. It means you can stop blaming yourself for lack of willpower or waiting for the right feeling. It means you can stop consuming endless motivational content and start building actual behavior systems. It means you can work with human psychology rather than against it. The person who understands that motivation is unreliable and builds accordingly will achieve far more than the person with endless motivation but no system. Because when motivation meets Monday morning, motivation loses. But when systems meet Monday morning, systems execute regardless of feelings. And that's the difference between people who dream and people who achieve.